So let's talk about why we will not see a reboot, a remake, a remaster, a reimagining of Kojima's 1994 cult classic Policenauts. Let's talk about some of those reasons. Let's talk about why the original copies and the ROMs and etc. will likely hold their own into the future, the foreseeable future, maybe indefinitely, and why we will not see these reimaginings of Kojima's cult classic. Now, the most recent Kojima title, I've played maybe 10 hours of it, touches on some of these concepts, but not in the same way as we will discuss here with Policenauts. I'm not going to get into Kojima's other titles. That might be all I mention here of Death Stranding, but I want to focus on the basics here. So the year is 1994, and that is when Kojima released Policenauts. Now, arguably, you could say he was in development for several years prior. He admits in a 1996 article that the downtime during the development of Snatcher was when he basically hatched the idea of Policenauts. They were running into issues in development, and it gave a rise to this new idea of Policenauts. Now, first and foremost, we should talk about Kojima's creative control over the Policenauts development. Kojima himself essentially created his own scripting engine. I can't speak intelligently about all of the technical things that he had achieved, but the issues during the development of Snatcher and Metal Gear several years prior created a scenario where Kojima wanted more control. He didn't like, paraphrasing some 1996 interviews, he didn't like when he lost control of, for example, when music would be cued. He couldn't time it correctly. It was very hard for him to discuss with his developers when sound would come in, when it would fade out. And why is that important? And we're going to connect all this here in a minute. Kojima wanted to create a cinematic experience. And anybody who's played a point-and-click game knows that you're essentially watching a movie. You're essentially clicking through a movie, and each click will correspond to progressing the scene forward. That's pretty self-explanatory. Point-and-click games are relatively outdated at this point, and a more modern audience, a younger audience, might not have any idea what a point-and-click game is. We're not going to dig much deeper into that. Suffice it to say, it's essentially a cinematic experience, right? So, where are we in 1994? A lot of things going on, but predominantly some of the concepts that Kojima touched upon were very sensitive to him. They were very intimate in terms of where he was cognitively, mentally, psychologically. In a 1996 interview, he discusses some of the topics as being essentially dinner table conversations. So some of the concepts that Kojima touches on in Policenauts, in my opinion, will prevent or block or obstruct or at least provide great difficulty for any reboot attempts. Just the concepts, nothing to do with licensing or the rights, trademarks, copyrights, intellectual property concerns, all of those set aside. So in 1994, we have a scenario where your average person, speaking of the Western world here, of course, your average person did not necessarily own a computer, a personal computer, a Mac, what have you, and likewise probably did not even own a CD player. Probably, most likely, did not have any form of internet connectivity. If they did, maybe they were on a 56 28K modem, something of that regard. Now, this is I'm speaking in terms of your average person, right? There will be exceptions to that, of course. So in 1994, we see a game that is released that was maybe not regarded in the highest sense of being an absolute classic at the time. It has since evolved into a cult classic, some people saying it is the pinnacle of sci-fi video games. At the time, 1994, so we're talking, your average person is listening to a cassette player. The computer is probably, maybe in some people's homes, in the forms of a word processor. These are all antiquated technologies at this point. So how could Kojima have in various points in this game the concept of a CD player being obsolete comes up, and he has the kind of foresight now. Of course, in the year 2022, when this is being recorded, CD players are largely seen as obsolete. They have been replaced by various other forms of media. We all know what they are, and I will leave it at that. However, in '94, when most of the Western world was only coming to learn of the compact disc, a computer, if you had one, did not even have this media available. You were probably working on something like a 3.5-inch floppy disk or other media types. Kojima, and to tie this in a moment, Kojima had the foresight to talk about things like digital media in 1994, the obsolescence of the CD player, which was only in its infancy. I'm stressing this because it seems that he did not only have the foresight along those lines, those narrow lines, CD player obsolete. Okay, you could say anybody throwing some futuristic guesses out there could say, well, of course the CD player will become obsolete. But in 1994, we were also fantasizing about flying cars. There were several TV shows in the West at the time, in the mid to late 90s, that suggested beyond the year 2000, we will be flying around in cars like the Jetsons. That has obviously not come to pass. So if Kojima was spot on about the obsolescence of the CD player, what other things could he have been spot on about? Well, if you are even remotely familiar with Policenauts, you will know that the game has to do with space exploration, the NAUTS, the NAUTS part of Policenauts being the primary focus. Of course, the plot has to do with police and a futuristic police force, but the space aspect of it is predominantly stressed throughout the game. The household discussions of the 1994 timeframe may have included, particularly in Japan, the first Japanese person to go into space, the first person to go into space in 1990. In the United States in 1994, the STS-62 NASA mission, where a crew of 5 spent 14 days in space experimenting with the growth of crystals in microgravity. And then there was a spin-off Discovery Channel TV show as a result. The West, the United States, also was the first to genetically engineer tomatoes, and they became available to the public in 1994, and the use of genetically modified foods was approved. We saw the Ebola virus outbreak continuing in Zaire, which had a 90% mortality rate. And in a 1996 interview, Kojima stresses that the things that he was concerned about, his family, his friends, his colleagues, due to all of the space-related ongoings, they were concerned about, well, what are the effects of being in space? What does it feel like? And these were common conversations in Japan due to the influx of brand new NASA information. So the first Japanese person goes into space, they're working with NASA. Many documents and news were becoming available in Japan for the first time, and it was captivating. So what are some of the concepts that Kojima could have been spot on about in 1994 that would prohibit or otherwise make extremely difficult a reboot, a remake, a reimagining? Well, we're talking about some heavy topics here, and in general, a darker sense of space. Space as an anomaly. Space as a foe. Space as a potential enemy, an unknown, a place where things aren't what they seem to be. A dark overlay over what traditionally today is viewed as a positive, uplifting, progressive move for the human race into the future. Kojima paints an entirely different picture of this in 1994. Kojima discusses biotech, micro machines, nanomachines, AI, space exploration, the predominance of pharmaceutical drugs, their use and abuse, organ trafficking and harvesting and transplantation, various scientific advancements he portrays these all in a very incongruent manner with how we perceive them today. He paints a darker picture. Some could say he paints a more realistic picture of the future. Towards the end of the game, the cinematic experience, towards the end, it becomes clear that the pharmaceutical avenues, their misuse of narcotics and organ harvesting, are the only way. The abuse of these, not the loving use and promotion and progressive nature of their existence, but the abuse, the negative, is the only way that humankind can exist in space. They hint at the insurmountable psychological toll that space takes on the human being. Drugs and, as they refer to it in the game, spare parts, spare organs, are the only way that humans can persist and continue to explore in space. Without weighing so heavily and relying on the pharmaceutical, biological, technical misuse, space exploration would be impossible. That is what Gates Becker, the police chief, the corrupt police chief, admits to at the very end of the game. He says, if I didn't sell out to this Tokugawa company, this large conglomerate who breaches all avenues of production, every industry. They even have a lunar base where they conduct a lot of illegal research. He says, if I didn't sell out to this company, to this corporation, this conglomerate, space exploration would be impossible. And this character says in the game, I'm imagining Kojima would hold these thoughts as well. Without that, space is a fantasy. If we don't do these things, space is a fantasy. And the only way that Policenauts, the concept of space, the concept of this new beyond world that he created, this world away from Earth that exists in space with its own artificial environments and gravity, was created in Kojima's mind to only exist through the abuse of science. Without the drug abuse and things of this nature, it would have been impossible for humanity to leave Earth, and it was deemed a necessary evil by both the police chief and the pharmaceutical company and the leaders of Beyond and Earth working side by side to say to the effect of, yes, we know this is negative, we know this is bad, we're just ahead of our time. And to quote Gates Becker, the police chief, he says, we are just picking up where God left off. To which the main character, Jonathan Ingram, is repulsed and essentially, after having found that the police chief that he worked for previously in a prior life has been totally corrupted, is totally in disarray and disbelief. And it's this portrayal of space that a reboot, a remake, a remaster cannot dilute without totally changing the game. So my main argument here is the dark painting that Kojima has painted here of space, technology, everything. Even the nano machines, the micro machines, they talk about mosquitoes flying around. There's a part in the game where a mosquito flies around, and you're wondering what the big deal is. Why do you have to catch this mosquito? You have to click around on the screen. You find out that the mosquito is actually harboring some sort of medicinal product in its body that could cause harm, and the mosquitoes were designed to do this. Now, this concept is oddly present in today's world. It's almost ubiquitous and old news. So Kojima was not only on point about a obsolescence of the CD player, he was also correct about various things. The oddly on-point criticisms of nicotine abuse, the technology that they use to consume cigarettes in space in the future, oddly similar to the vaping phenomenon that we have now, a variety of things. And he was not only spot on about those, but I believe he was spot on in his timing. The early 90s, I believe, would probably be the only time where this negative portrayal of space exploration and otherwise wondrous experience for the human race, this wondrous achievement that your ordinary person could not see any negativity in this pursuit of going to the moon, going to Mars, going to space is all positive. It's all positive today. This negative portrayal of the time, I don't think could be removed from the game. I don't think there is any way to do it. I'm not a developer. Maybe there are some shortcuts here, but it is so embedded into the DNA of his story, his cinematic experience, which plays out marvelously. It's genius in its execution. I don't think there's any way to handle that and have it fit in today's scientific paradigm. You could talk about some of the inappropriate moments in the game where you could touch the other characters and break the fourth wall. Those things set aside, and they were censored. Parts of those things were censored. If you know the game, you know what I'm talking about. Those were removed for, I think, the PlayStation version. The Sega Saturn version, the 3DO, I believe, all contain these kind of crude breaking the fourth wall moments, which are kind of shocking when they do occur, but they're fun nonetheless. And take those aside. The heart and soul of the game, I think, its own nature will prevent it from a reboot. Now, I have a sense that we might see something, an evolution of the franchise, if it can be brought back, if Kojima maintains any, or wishes to maintain any ties to these old cult classic games. Again, I'm not going to talk into the points of the other games. Admittedly, I'm less familiar, but for these reasons, I just don't think we will. I highly recommend Kojima's Policenauts as a cinematic experience. It still holds up today. It's way ahead of its time in many, many areas. And to put your mind back in 1994, if you were around then, and have that kind of foresight and the timing, and it leads me to another thought. This game, I believe, would only have been possible with Kojima's creative control. As mentioned before, he created his own scripting engine. He wanted to maintain control here. And some people, I think, fault him for that. They say he goes too off the rails. There's a lot of negativity about Death Stranding. And some, including myself, were kind of repulsed, or at least very curious as to this concept of carrying a bridge baby around, this use of an infant carried in some sort of technological fluid-filled cradle that gives you essentially superpowers. I saw that and I said, wow, this is not Metal Gear. This is not, this is nothing I'm really familiar with. And lo and behold, Policenauts. And let's think about that for a second. Policenauts was closer in time to the moon landing when it was released than we are from the release of Policenauts. We're in a totally different world. It's sometimes very difficult to draw these comparisons. But nonetheless, my firm belief here is that we will not see a reboot. If you want to enjoy this game, I believe you must get familiar with the classics, the old school way to play it. Use it as a case study. Use it as a way to just expand your knowledge about what things were like not that long ago, how things have changed. The concept in years past, which was present in children's cartoons, daytime television, films, comic books, video games, any sort of entertainment media, was the concept of the mad scientist. There was always a mad scientist. Even in Pinky and the Brain, what is Brain always trying to do? Right? He was trying to take over the world. That was his gig. I'm not up to date on all the brand new cartoons, but I could be pretty confident that the concept of the mad scientist today is nowhere near, infinitesimally less prevalent than it was years ago. So Kojima was operating in this totally different paradigm of the mad scientist, the uncertainty of space, the uncertainty of technology, and he created this game at just the right moment in time. I think even just a few years into the future, beyond 1994, would have prohibited this. And so we have this snapshot, a very, very unique snapshot in time to view many of the concepts that are now ubiquitous. They're everywhere. You can't even look at your cell phone without being informed about some of the concepts that he was talking about. Most of them, unfortunately, it seems, have come true in a negative way. There are a lot of positives. We've advanced a lot. But there are the negatives, and I think both the good and the bad, he nailed their importance. Whether right or wrong, their prevalence in society, he was spot on. Now, you could say you don't like it, you do like it. Regardless, their importance and their prevalence, he was spot on. And I think that's really the hallmark of a classic. This is one of my first voiceover attempts. If you like how I presented, if you have any critiques, would like to know more information, any other Kojima games, any games in general, if you'd like me to dig more deeper into Policenauts, Snatcher, or otherwise, hit the like button, subscribe. This channel is in its infancy. I'm trying to test the waters here. You will see a variety of content. This is Retro Renovo. Thanks for listening.